Welcome to this session of MinnPost Festival. I'm Tanner Curl. I'm the Executive Director of MinnPost. We're really excited to have this live podcast recording of the Breakdown podcast with our special guests. Before I hand it over to them, I just want to say a special thanks to our MinnPost Festival sponsors, our supporters. I want to thank our MinnPost members. I want to thank the people who have joined and become members today. If you're a member, if you become a member, you can get that tote bag out in the Commons area. And just if you've forgotten, you scan that QR code on the back of your name tag, and a convenient donate link pops up. So just to make it easy for you. I'm excited to introduce our lineup here for this live podcast recording. Co-host of The Breakdown is Michael Brodkorb, who has worked on numerous campaigns and served in various capacities at the Republican Party of Minnesota. Also co-host of The Breakdown is Becky Scherr, who has worked on several GOP campaigns for statewide candidates in Minnesota, as well as for the Republican Party of Minnesota, serving as both communications and executive director. Michelle Benson is a lifelong Minnesotan and former Republican state senator. During her 12-year tenure, she served in several leadership roles, including as chair of the Health and Human Services Committee during COVID. And John, I should have asked this before we started. How do you pronounce your last name?
Rouleau.
Rouleau. John Rouleau is a Minnesota-based conservative political strategist and public affairs professional with over a decade of experience in state, local, and federal campaigns in Minnesota and throughout the country. They're going to be talking about reviving the Republican Party here in Minnesota. Let's welcome them to the festival.
Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
We are overjoyed to be here today for an extra special episode, as it is our first live in-person episode and first live in-person recording here at the MinnPost Festival.
Becky and I started this podcast 2 years ago, and like this festival, we always wanted to have a goal of bringing voices together for insightful conversations. We wanted to show that can have civil conversations and disagree without being disagreeable. For those of you in the room with us, we're so grateful that you chose to spend some time with us today. We would love for you to become regular listeners and encourage you to listen to some of our past episodes over the last few years. We've had the opportunity to interview Congressman Dean Phillips, a Majority Whip Tom Emmer, a Secretary of State Steve Simon. We've talked with state legislators and candidates from all parts of the political spectrum, and we've been blown away with the conversations that can occur when you put differences aside and truly listen. And I just want to say on a personal note to Becky, thank you so much for doing this. This is a culmination of years of just working together in this podcast, and it means so much to be in this room with such distinguished people. And Becky, thank you so much.
I'm happy to be here. But today we are going to be focusing on the right side of the aisle. Michael and I both come from partisan backgrounds, having spent more than a decade in the Republican politics world. That said, we both feel a little out of step with the Republican Party and MAGA movement, and like many Republicans in the state and across the country, struggle with how to move forward. Today, we are joined by former State Senator Michelle Benson and John Rouleau to break down the challenges facing the Republican Party. Michelle Benson, like Tanner mentioned, is a lifelong Minnesotan and former state senator from Ham Lake. She spent 12 years fighting the good fight up at the state capitol and served as deputy leader and Health and Human Services chair. John Rouleau is the executive director of the Minnesota Jobs Coalition and has been active in Minnesota Republican politics and campaigning for years. Today, Today we will break down the state of the Republican Party here in Minnesota and why the MNGOP has struggled statewide. We will discuss the importance of the two-party system, and we will end by breaking down the future of the Republican Party, what the Republican Party might look like post-Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and how we can regain voter support and trust.
Before we kick things off, I want to take a note that we will be taking questions from the audience. That also includes my family that's there, so be careful. MinnPost staff is helping us with this, so if you have a question, write it in a note card, and we will do our best to work those questions into the conversation, except those from my family. There you are right there. People in the t-shirts.
Perfect.
Again, not my family, but people in the t-shirts.
So something that some of you may know, but not all of you may know, is that Minnesota has not cast our ballots for a Republican for president since Richard Nixon in 1972. That's the longest streak in the country, aside from Washington, D.C. So Republicans also on a statewide level have had some struggles over the years. We have not elected a U.S. Senator since Norm Coleman. We have not elected a governor from the Republican Party since Tim Pawlenty. So it has been about 18 years since a successful statewide election for Republicans. So today, we're going to chat a little bit about that. I have had the privilege of knowing these three for 10, 12, 14 years. I worked with Michael when I worked on Tom Emmer's gubernatorial campaign when he was at the state party. I worked with John. We both served in our local BPOU party unit in St. Paul. And then I started up at the state capitol right when Senator Benson started in 2011. I was working as a staffer. And that was an interesting year because it was a year that Republicans took back the House. They won the majority in the Senate, I believe, for the first time in 34 years.
Almost 40.
Almost 40 years. Yet Republicans failed across all constitutional offices. We did not win any of the constitutional seats. So Minnesotans, we know, like to go back and forth. So Senator Benson, I want to start with you, talking a little bit about starting up at the Capitol in such a unique situation. And without going into, we don't need to go into the specifics of any missteps or campaigns in particular, but why do you think that is, that we were so successful in the House and in the Senate, but did not get any of those constitutional seats?
Well, and first of all, thank you for doing this. Thank all of you for being here. It's a lovely Saturday afternoon, and you might not actually care what happens to the Republican Party, but you care enough about Minnesota to sit in the room. So thank you for doing that. So legislative races go door to door and have authentic connections with people in neighborhoods. It's very hard for a statewide race to have an authentic connection. It takes a really unique person for someone to watch a TV ad or hear someone in a debate and say, you know what, I think they understand me. And so I think that's some of the differential. So when Mark Dayton and Tom Emmer were running that race, it was really close. And I think the Dayton name and some of the warm feelings from people who remembered, was it Santa Bear? But honestly, I think there was just a little bit of warm fuzzy, to be a little bit ironic, that pushed Mark Dayton over. They felt like they could trust him, even if they didn't authentically know him. And I think that made a difference in that year. There was also a massive deficit, and so I think there were some ticket splitters who were like, you know what, let's give Republicans something so that we can make some spending decisions, but for the big thing, we want a name we recognize.
Minnesota has, in 2008, we had a notorious recount. In 2010, we had a recount. John, you've worked a lot on races of all levels. What do you think has kind of contributed since that time to the decline of the Republican Party on a statewide level?
You know, I think when we look at what a campaign is, it boils down to a few things. And there's the message, there's the messenger, there's the way that you get the message out, and then there's money. It probably won't surprise anybody that in a statewide race in Minnesota, you start at a deficit if you're a Republican. The Democrats really need to run up the score in Hennepin County, in Ramsey County, and we've recently seen some trends in some of those other counties in the metro where that's moving away from Republicans. You can make up a lot of that as you look statewide, but you've got to find a way to connect. And I think looking at the message and the messenger is something that Republicans, have struggled with. You can look
You're
at...
being very polite.
You can look at the surveys, though, right? And if we look at the issues across the board that voters say are most important to them, it might surprise a lot of you in here to know that Republicans are more trusted on a bunch of those issues, right? They're more trusted on taxes and spending, on crime, on immigration. But we have this disconnect, and I think a lot of it is that Republicans have a message that can connect with the voters, and they choose to emphasize the issues that don't. And that's a decision. And some of that some of that really comes down to the process that we have in Minnesota, where we have this incentive structure that is not too dissimilar to what we see statewide, where the person with the loudest microphone, the person who ends up in the news the most, can go out and raise those small dollar campaign contributions. The more that you kind of breathe fire, the more you can raise that money. And we see that with the endorsement process too, right? The loudest voice who is kind of out there rallying their troops. It's not a place where you can have kind of those nuanced conversations where I would say the vast majority of Minnesotans come down on these issues, right? There's this misperception that swing voters and those voters in the middle are moderates on those issues, right? You're a moderate on gun control, you're a moderate on abortion, you're a moderate on taxes or education or whatever it is. What we really see is that there's competing issues. And as we look at where those are, someone might feel very passionately about the issue of abortion or equal marriage. They might equally feel passionately about taxes and spending. And what they're trying to do is make that decision in their head about which one is going to be most important to them as they go to pull that lever. And for the last couple of elections, Republicans have decided to take the issues that they're in the minority on and make those the focal point, instead of saying this is what we agree on with 55-60% of the state, and really emphasize those. And that's a tactical problem, but it's also the incentive structure to get endorsed. It's the incentive structure to raise those small dollar contributions, and it sets Minnesota Republicans back.
Michael, can I put you on the spot real quick?
Go right ahead.
So we talked a little bit about how Michael and I feel a little out of step with the state party. And I like to give Michael a hard time, but in the last election cycle, Michael did endorse Tim Walz for governor. And he has endorsed Vice President Harris for president. So on the messaging side, because I think this is something we've talked a lot about on our podcast and something we completely agree with John on this matter. You're somebody who has felt a little alienated from our candidates. I want to hear a little bit from you of maybe some of those issues and messaging statements that are reasons why we are losing voters like you and others around the state from distractions, poor candidates, and poor messaging.
One of the issues that I've seen with the party has been, and I came through the party process. I was the deputy chair and served in a variety of capacities. But I think the problem is that the best messenger in election cycles is not the parties per se, it's the candidates. And the Republican Party, I think the endorsement process has produced candidates that I don't think are good messengers in an election cycle. When someone goes to vote, it's not as if they're voting for the party platform on the Republican side and the Democrat. The messenger and how that's kind of manifested is the candidates. And my struggle has been with some of the candidates that the party has supported and endorsed. They're not good messengers. And that's the challenge where I have is that and it's part of the journey that I've gone through in the last few weeks, particularly since I announced my support for Harris and Walz, is that I had to do some soul searching as to whether I was still a Republican. And I am a Republican, but I believe that there's a need for a vibrant two-party system. But I fundamentally believe the challenge that exists right now is the candidates that the party is supporting, and they're not endorsing or promoting candidates that I think ultimately are going to be in our position that are going to win things, are able to win over voters. I think the biggest, most significant political education that I've had is not when I was working on campaigns or serving in a party capacity, but it's been a dad in the suburbs and talking with parents at soccer games and softball games and at school meetings and in neighborhoods. And the Republican Party has to do a much better job of messaging to those people on issues that matter. And some of the issues that Republicans are choosing to talk about represent problems in terms of what voters want to hear. And I think that's the challenge right now for Republicans, is that what's the relevancy of their message?
And Senator, I want to follow up with you because I know while you're not serving at the state legislature, you're still helping your friends, you're still out talking to voters. What are you hearing from these people? Because like John said, the issues that resonate, I mean, we all know the price of things are getting better, but over the summer in particular, the price of gas, the price of eggs, our energy costs, things are really, really tough for families.
Things aren't getting better, they're just not getting bad as fast as they were.
Exactly. So when you're talking to voters, what are some of those issues that we're missing the connection with voters and not getting them to go to the ballot and cast their ballot on the statewide level for Republicans?
And I think there's some candidates who are too in their own bubble. Now, if you're in a bubble in your district and that's who you represent, okay, that's your job. You're going to get elected. But if you're in statewide office and you're staying in a social media bubble where you never even contemplate that somebody might have a different perspective or that something else might be true, they start to believe their own hype. And when somebody goes to them and says, your numbers aren't polling well, you don't look great when you talk about, okay, I'm gonna, straight up, one of my pet peeves in the governor, I got a lot from the governor's race, but one of my pet peeves was delegates coming up to me saying, there are litter boxes in the high school at Bemidji. Oh, just wait. And I would say to them, do you have a picture? Well, no. And I said, everybody you know has a camera on their phone. Every kid in that school has a camera on their phone. Please don't spread that rumor until you see a picture from that high school. And the delegate kind of stopped for a minute, and I said, we need to talk about things that are going to win votes. I'm like, oh yeah. So I think a little tough love with caucus members and delegates. Frankly, I was as upset. I watched the debate. I shouldn't. It's not good for me. But when Donald Trump started talking about the cats, I had the same sort of PTSD. Like, if there's not a picture, don't talk about it. He could have taken that opportunity and listed the names of people who'd been killed by illegal immigrants. Or he could have done straight up numbers between his administration and another administration. But he decided he was going to go with something populist that made him feel good in his bubble instead of working on winning votes. Running for office isn't about making you feel good. It's about winning enough votes so that the things that matter to you, you get to actually work on. And I think we've got some candidates who've forgotten that it's not about them. And so that's where I'd start.
So we're going to end by spending the bulk of our time about the future, but I want to just go down the line and ask a question here, because this is something Michael hit on, the importance of a two-party structure. Even Chair Ken Martin of the DFL has said he wants a vibrant Republican Party. He wants competition in the state. It is healthy to have the best candidate, the best elected officials serving us all. And to have that, we need a little help on the Republican side. Now, the Republican Party itself has gone through a lot of issues up over the years. We're certainly lacking in the money and the infrastructure that the DFL has. But I want to kind of bypass that a little bit and just get to the crux of, and John, starting with you, why is that two-party system so important, and how do you think we get back there?
You know, over the last, it's been longer than since before Trump, but there used to be an idea, that the two parties essentially want the same things. We all want the country to do better. We all want kids to be able to read. We all want people to be able to earn a good, honest living and live the American dream. And really what we're having this disagreement on is what is the best way to achieve that for the people of Minnesota, for the people of the United States. And somewhere along the line, it shifted to, if you don't agree with me on the path to get there, you're evil. And that's just not the case. I don't think there is anybody at the state capitol who wants Minnesota to do worse, who wants our kids to be able to not read as well. I might disagree with them very strongly on how to get there, but we don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and neither do the Democrats, right? When Ken Martin is out there bragging that the Minnesota Democrats passed the most liberal agenda in the entire country, I don't think that it's a good thing for Minnesota to be a test laboratory for whatever the policy du jour is. We need to have conversations and get some balance. And it's not just me saying this, right? This is Democratic senators say, I wish we'd been a little bit less progressive. You know, we've got Gene Pulowski down in Winona, who is an outgoing state representative, saying, gee, divided government would be a really good thing for Minnesota. But there's no monopoly on ideas for how to get there. And when we can have those conversations and when you listen to the other voices in the room, it makes you test your ideas. It makes you prove it out. It makes you make sure that it actually works. As opposed to one party, which we saw over the last 2 years, where they can just twist an arm and make sure that it passes and get it implemented. And they don't have to think about what the outcome is or what it looks like, because that's not healthy for Minnesota. It's not healthy for our political process, and it does not breed trust in our state and in our elected officials.
And I would say the two parties matter outside the Capitol and inside. So when we're having an election, there needs to be some overlap between what I would call a rightward agenda and a leftward agenda, so that the voices who don't fit into the left or the right have a place to go. And if you don't have two robust debates on either side of an issue, that voter has no place to say, this candidate matches me. They can never see themselves in government. So then we end up with people on the extreme left and on the extreme right and a whole bunch of Minnesotans who don't feel heard. And so 2-3 parties, if that's what it takes, the purpose of government is to represent the people. So outside the Capitol, 2 parties, 3 parties matters. Inside the Capitol, if you don't have conflict on a policy, you will never see the bright spot where the right answer is. Aaron Murphy and I went to loggerheads over healthcare. Now Senator Aaron Murphy, Representative Tina Liebling and I went to loggerheads about policy. We might not have gotten it right, but I'll guarantee you, in the end, it was more workable for Minnesotans than wherever each of us started. Whether it was my policy or her policy, wherever we ended up was more workable and tested. Do you know how when you smash 2 rocks together, you sometimes get a spark? That's how you make good policy. It's the honest debate that goes back and forth between people of goodwill, but from different perspectives. And the more we send people who are just about them and only answer to the noisiest voices who live in a bubble, the harder it is to create that spark.
Michael, I want you to kind of join together these thoughts and some of the interviews that we've done over the last 2 years, because we heard a lot of this from legislators that we talked to about how from Republicans not getting hearings, not getting time, not having testimonies from important folks because of the single party rule. They thought, and what we've seen some issues with some of the legislation, that there were some issues with policy because of the lack of competition and because of the lack of two-party structure up at the Capitol. Can you chat a little bit about that?
It is a subject that we discuss because, I mean, I think there's we've tried to have discussions, Becky, about, and one of the advantages that we have in terms of these discussions is we're providing a safe space for these to have these discussions. And I think what we're trying to prevent is a little bit of that tribalism, some of that of the rancor that exists. And far too often, I think the partisanship is the fight is, and I blame a lot of it on social media. That's dictating the approach that we're just discussing on policy. Ultimately, I think it's important. Why, in regards to the two-party system, is Republicans and Democrats need to start agreeing, and I think Republicans need to show more that they're interested in actually governing. I think that's the problem that I think Republicans have to show, that it's not about just being an opposition party, but that it's about being a leadership party. That's about presenting ideas within the context of working towards collaboration. And I think the challenge that I think that Republicans have right now is that the mindset is they think government is the enemy of everything. And it's difficult to have people that want to be both the arsonist and firefighter working in the same path. And you have to pick and choose on some of that stuff sometimes. And so I'd like to see Republicans, and I think it's a challenge, we can talk about it more in this episode, but about the candidates that are endorsing, are they being relevant to the discussion? Is it going to be value added? Because what Senator Benson was talking about is that kind of spark that can happen. That's why I'm a big believer in the campaign process, and that's why I think it's so important that political parties are endorsing candidates that can help, because state, as John also alluded to, that state governments can be that kind of laboratories of democracy. Campaigns can also be that too, and if we have thoughtful discussions. And so that's the challenge right now, I think, is existing on our side.
Well, and I want to take issue with one of the things that you said, though, about Republicans not being willing to govern, because I spent a lot of time at the Capitol over the last 2 years, and Republicans were, in good faith, raising concerns with the legislation that the DFL was passing, and they had the votes to do whatever they wanted to. And you could listen, you could hear the Republicans acknowledge this, right? They said, I understand that you don't need my vote to get this done, but you're making a mistake. And we've seen that borne out in the court process, where the Democrats' laws that they passed are being struck down exactly like they were told they would be, because they didn't want to take any of those good ideas. They didn't want help with governing. And, let's be really clear, right? If you win elections, you get to govern. You don't have to listen to the other party. That's a decision that the DFL could make, is that they didn't care what Republicans had to say, and they don't need to, because they had control of the legislative process. But the idea that Republicans don't have an interest in governing, I just think that in Minnesota specifically, that's not my experience. I see where they're trying to improve these bills, where they're trying to have legitimate conversations, whether it was Senator Coleman bringing a conservative approach to universal paid family leave, whether it was Harry Niska sitting in the Capitol late in the hours at night and warning, this is why this bill is going to get struck down, months before it was struck down. The Democrats have to listen if they want help with governing. And I think Republicans would welcome being able to actually pass an amendment when they're sitting in there and having debate on this bill, instead of just having to offer amendment after amendment after amendment, knowing it's going to fail.
And I would say not a Republican problem, but a process problem. When you have one party completely in control of the legislature without due respect for the functioning of institutions, you start to see a collapse, because then the next group thinks that that's normal. You got a group of freshmen who have never seen what it means to have decorum. And so when they move up and they become leaders, they're like, oh, we don't have to. Conference committee process. I know, super nerdy. It really matters. I was on a panel with Senator Tony Laurie, and he and I talked about the first conference committee. He said, I knew every amendment, you were gonna have a question about it. And every amendment, you were gonna have good points. So even though I had the votes, I had to be able to answer your questions, because publicly, you were never gonna shame me, but you were going to expect that I could answer the questions. So there's some process things that are bringing our once nation-leading legislature down. We had, like, Minnesota Care. It's the first ever middle-class, working-class healthcare system. That came out of bipartisan conflict. Charter schools, we did first. And then they kind of languished. So we're losing some opportunities to have really smart people in productive conflict in a process that's transparent. And if we don't have two strong parties, we'll never be able to claw that back.
Just to follow up on that, because I think it is true. I mean, I think the challenge that we have right now is, I think there are great Republican members of the legislature. I think Republicans have a wonderful farm team. The problem is, when you Republicans endorse a candidate for statewide office like Royce White, that drowns out the ability for those Republicans to be seen through. And that's the challenge that I have right now, is that the Republicans can't, I mean, look, as I've consistently said, a Republican running against Senator Klobuchar is an uphill battle. How big of a hill? It's Mount Everest.
Everest.
The size of Mount Everest. But that doesn't mean you can just, throw that opportunity away. And the challenge is that when you have Republicans at the statewide level running as there, it distracts from the good work that other Republicans are doing. And that's the challenge I think that our party needs to work on.
And so let's talk about something the Republican Party doesn't do well. Let's say a competent person wanted to run against Senator Klobuchar. Is there any employer who's going to say, you know what, I'm going to let you do your professional work, and we're going to keep your health care, but you want to take a leave to go do this, we're going to support you. So then you get a competent person who's engaged in the economy, who has a chance. Because I'll tell you, the sacrifice it takes to run for statewide office, if you don't have a spouse making significant amounts of money and no responsibilities at home, I mean, like, don't take out the garbage level of no responsibilities at home, you can't do this. And the Republicans have not said, we see talent, not we're going to pay you to do nothing, but we're going to protect your economic future. And I was so fortunate that my family was all in when I ran for governor, and my neighbors were all in. I had people who would every Tuesday make sure my family had a hot meal. And it's really hard, and Republicans are bad at supporting productive, logical candidates.
We have questions that tie into this. And one of our first questions we're going to take today is, why are Republicans more likely to adhere to the party endorsement than Democrats?
Because
Wow.
nobody's undone it yet.
Well, I don't want to answer the question first, but you guys go ahead.
I will just say, I think we could do an entire, we've touched on this a little bit on some old podcast episodes, but it's really, I think, because it hasn't been done yet. I mean, it really, truly. Governor Dayton did not win the endorsement. Governor Walz did not win the endorsement. On the Democrat side, there has been multiple times where the candidate who wins the primary election is not the endorsed candidate. On the Republican side, that it just truly, aside from a couple state legislative races at a statewide level and congressional level, the endorsed candidate does win. And unfortunately, the endorsement process, as we see with, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think we all agree Royce White is a perfect example of a candidate who won the endorsement process, who is not the best candidate to represent Republicans on a statewide level, and proves just how broken that process is.
John.
Yeah, I think, as you look at the endorsement, Republicans tend to be more of a grassroots focused party. And there's this idea that the endorsement is representative because it's an open process and anybody can go. But there's a lot of gatekeeping around the endorsement process. And I think that's kind of a misleading narrative that this is who the party wants. And the reality is that the endorsement is who the establishment of the party wants. They brand anybody who's not, on the inside of that. Anybody who's not on the inside of that gets branded as the establishment. But the people who run the party are, by definition, the establishment. And they look at this, and the endorsement matters because you essentially get the good housekeeping seal of approval. But I think that it would be much more representative of the party to go to a primary system, right? I'm a father of a young child. If I have to go to caucus on Tuesday night, right, so right in the middle of bedtime.
In a snowstorm. This year was snowstorm.
I've got to go take a Saturday out of our day and go to a BPOU convention. Then I've got a congressional district convention, and then I've got a weekend in Duluth or Rochester or Bloomington or whatever it is. I've got, a night away from my kid just to be able to go there, and then I've got 4 or 5 days where I'm away from my family to be able to go play politics and hang out and argue about the platform and endorse a candidate. Or we could have a primary where every Republican in the state has an opportunity to go cast a ballot. And I think we need to have that conversation and look at what's more representative and what provides us with those grassroots conservatives having more of a voice in the process.
So if you're a hockey mom, I'm not. But let's say you're a conservative hockey mom. hockey family. Who's going to caucus on a Tuesday night during ice time to fill out both of your names in the hope that one of you or both of you become a delegate? And then the BPOU convention, Saturday, probably a tournament day. And then your CD convention, you probably need to get a hotel room. Now, if you're a hockey family, you probably have some points. You might be able to get a comped hotel room. And then May comes, the first nice weekend, maybe you're done with hockey, and now you're going to spend 3 days. Okay, Duluth, when we had I chaired the 18 convention in Duluth. It was a gorgeous weekend. I was so sad I was at the podium, but it was gorgeous in Duluth. Actually, I was happy. Jim Nash was with me. We had a great convention. But the point is, these are the barriers to sort of the average. I want to be engaged. I understand how important it is that I vote, and I want good candidates, and I just can't. And that's the reality of, I came up through the caucus process, 2006. The people to this day who are my best friends, we walked 2006 as delegates together. But they can't be there anymore because they're busy. And I do it because I did it.
This is, I don't know who wrote this question, but it gives me an opportunity just very quickly to say some of my favorite points from history. The last time the Republican-endorsed candidate for governor got more than 50% of the vote was 1978. The last time the Republican-endorsed candidate for U.S. Senate got more than 50% of the vote was 88. Last time the Republican-endorsed candidate won statewide office was 2006. So the Democrats, by nature, being the formation of the Farmer, Labor, and Democratic Party, are more of a coalitions party. It's evidence shows they just simply work better together in the party process. And Republicans have to model some of that, particularly their allegiance to the endorsement process.
This time has flown by. We literally have 5 minutes left, and I want to spend 5 minutes on where we go from here. These questions we're going to take with us. We're going to use in a future episode. So if you got asked a question, did not get answered, we will take these. We will readdress them in a future episode. But I got about a minute for each of you. Where do we go from here? And regardless of what this election looks like, how do we move beyond this new MAGA Donald Trump world without alienating the base that we have created here to attract more Republicans? $1 million question in 60 seconds, Senator Benson.
Piece of cake. First of all, the donors have to stop bifurcating, trifurcating their efforts. So Republican donors need to say, we're going to pick a horse, because that's the only way you're going to get through the primary process. For my fellow delegates, for my fellow caucus attendees, we need to have candid conversations about winning. And I said this at the state convention, so I'll say it on the podcast too. You need to win elections and build trust so you can move your principles to build trust and win elections. This is the way you grow the party. This is the way they did it in Iowa. They did have to get a statewide office first, and then that person was dedicated to building the trust of the voters based on the principles they held and getting more voters and moving more principles and building trust. We cannot go from 0 to 100 in the structure we have right now.
John?
Where we go from here, I think, is going to be a really interesting thing to work on for the next 4, 5, 6 years. And what I would say is, don't expect the Republican Party to get rid of Donald Trump's agenda. I think that we have seen an influx of new voters and supporters that has a little bit more of a populist bent. But what I would say is that the candidates and politicians who try to remake themselves in the image of Donald Trump have not been successful throughout our country. There's only one Donald Trump. And after Donald Trump is no longer in office, I think that you're going to see that there's a lot of cheap knockoffs, and they don't do well. They're not going to do well. And you can look at who's doing well in elections around the country and throughout Minnesota this year just to see what that looks like. Now, that doesn't mean that you stop focusing on the unfairness of the trade deals that are occurring with China. That doesn't mean that the Republican doesn't shift a little bit to the left in Donald Trump's image on certain issues, a little bit to the right on certain issues. But we have that broad tent in the Republican Party where you have everybody from kind of your fiscally, center right, socially center left voter in the suburbs to your true believing, fire breathing MAGA supporter, or the people who were supportive of Ron Paul. We have libertarians, we have populists, we have nationalists, we have good old-fashioned Chamber of Commerce conservatives. And where we come to a outcome, we're going to have to take a look at what do we all agree on and what can we work on together.
I'll be very brief and just say, I think conversations like this are exactly where we go. I think there needs to be a space for a principled conservative like myself and also someone like you, John. I'm just joking. I'm just joking. That was a joke. I'm the Republican for Harris up here, so I wanted to just needle him a bit. But
you're going to endorse more Democrats than Arnie Carlson by the end of this election, huh?
And that's the second line that you've gotten today. That's going to be great. No, but I think this is what we need to do. I think there needs to be discussions. And I think John said it the best. There needs to be a space for that tent to be where everyone feels included.
I'm just going to end with one. There was an op-ed that Governor Tim Pawlenty wrote after the insurrection a couple years back. He ended with, "A smart person once observed, we need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster. Republicans are now at that point." It's going to be a very interesting couple of years. We're going to continue to have these conversations. I'm going to make a plug that we hope you continue to listen along, participate. Follow us at BB BreakPod on Twitter. That's our website. You can obviously look at all of the materials and find out more of how you can get involved and listen. And we're really grateful that you all attended today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Just a few brief announcements. The closing keynote is going to be starting at 5:30 in the sanctuary. It's Ben Jealous and Tanya Allen talking about climate equity and exploring and enjoying the outdoors. So we hope you'll join us for that. Let's give another round of applause for our panelists for sharing their time and perspectives with us. Thank you all very much.